a vinda do professor Alpers é uma iniciativa da área de História da África, do nosso departamento, eu, Marina e Leila, que somos, não é, a área, e contou com o apoio tanto do NAP, Núcleo de Apoio à Pesquisa Brasil-África, quanto, principalmente, do Programa de Pós-Graduação em História Social. E, em grande parte, não só essa conferência, como as outras atividades, foram organizadas junto com a professora Juliana Magalhães, né, que é candidata a ingressante no nosso programa de pós-doutorado, né. E, bom, desde mais ou menos 2005, nós, professoras de História da África, estamos empenhadas, não é, num trabalho de consolidação dessa área, não é. Estava fazendo o cálculo, a gente formou pelo menos já 39 mestres e 49 mestres e 39 doutores, não é? Então, acho que é uma área muito pequena, mas bastante empenhada né, com a formação dos jovens pesquisadores, não é? A vinda do professor Alpers faz parte dessa preocupação que a gente tem em fazer com que os nossos alunos e pesquisadores entrem em contato com os clássicos, não é, da história da África, não é, tanto da África Atlântica quanto da África Austral e Oriental, não é. O professor Alpers, acho que é um dos grandes especialistas nesse mundo do Índico, não é, e nas relações que as diversas sociedades do Índico têm entre si, não é. Eu vou apresentar um pouquinho a biografia, ele tem uma larga biografia, principalmente uma biografia acadêmica muito ampla, então só vou dar algumas notícias, não é. Atualmente, o professor Alpers é professor emérito da Universidade da Califórnia, UCLA, e obteve o seu PhD na Escola de Estudos Orientais e Africanos de Londres, a SOAS, né, em 1966, e, além de lecionar na universidade, na UCLA, durante muito tempo, ele lecionou em universidades da Somália e da Tanzânia, não é, realizando pesquisas em vários arquivos africanos e, principalmente, nesses arquivos da África Oriental, não é. É autor de diversos artigos e numerosos livros, não é, que a gente conhece da nossa formação, não é? E parte das suas publicações estão disponíveis numa página da academia .edu ou .org, eu sempre .edu, então quem quiser entrar em contato mais direto, principalmente com as publicações mais recentes do professor Alpers, não é? Ele orientou 62 teses de doutorado, então, e entre os orientandos e os doutores que ele formou, não é, existem historiadores que a gente conhece muito bem, como, por exemplo, John Thornton, ou Roquinaldo Ferreira, ou Kathleen Sheldon, ou seja, acho que é um mestre, não é, de nossos mestres também, não é? Então, presidente da African Studies Associations, e tem entre nós alguns capítulos que estamos traduzindo, não é? Um capítulo que vai fazer parte do dossiê Moçambique, que vai sair na Revista de História, não é? Agora, nesse ano, não é? Com vários artigos a respeito de história de Moçambique, e também de uma coletânea que a gente está organizando, eu e Juliana, sobre o nosso convênio com a Eduardo Mondlane, não é? O convênio que a gente teve com a Universidade de Moçambique, não é? Então, já são 2 artigos que estão sendo traduzidos, não é? E espero que os outros livros e as outras obras sejam também contempladas, não é? Porque é uma referência importante para a gente, não é? Então, vou parar de falar, vou passar a voz para o professor Alpers, mas agradecendo muito a presença e essa oportunidade da gente...
Muito obrigado. Boa tarde a todos. Boa tarde a todos. Devo agradecer à professora Cristina
e também a doutora Juliana, que foi o fundador, que arranjar todas as coisas como os estudantes. Mas agora, falo em inglês, é mais fácil para mim e espero para vocês também. The independence, let me make sure, okay. The independence of Brazil in 1822 brought about a redefinition of Portugal's colonial presence in Africa. The blueprint for this transformation was drafted by the then Secretary of State for the Navy and Overseas Affairs, Sá da Bandeira, who in an 1836 report to the Portuguese Cortes argued for greater national control over the African colonies, the reduction of local autonomy, development of plantation economies, and increased colonization. The steady implementation of this more aggressive colonial policy over the following decades was marked by a regular process of royal push and colonial pushback, or at least delay. The more remote the colonial outpost, the greater the foot dragging. A critical and hotly contested element in this process was the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. In the first half of this paper, I examined how these several factors played out in the Northern Mozambique district of Cabo Delgado, paying particular attention to the role of the slave owners and the enslaved. In the second half, I take a close look at an invaluable document, the Register of Libertas for Cabo Delgado, as a source for the social history of Northern Mozambique. So, here's Ilya, and here's Karrimba Islands. The first section is Counting Heads, a Brief History. The first step in registering slaves, and eventually libertos, was to gain some idea of how many individuals fell into these categories. In a word, to establish a meaningful census. The Portuguese crown first became serious about Karrimba Islands. The first section is Counting Heads, a Brief History. The first step in registering slaves, and eventually libertos, was to gain some idea of how many individuals fell into these categories. In a word, to establish a meaningful census. The Portuguese crown first became serious about census taking in Mozambique in the last quarter of the 18th century. As Ana Paula Wagner carefully demonstrates, in 1776, the crown ordered a detailed census of its vassals with very specific instructions about what data were to be collected and how they were to be organized in annual reports. But the governor of Mozambique independently restricted the census to free white and mixed-race inhabitants, entirely excluding both free and enslaved Africans as well as Muslims. One consequence of restricting the definition of inhabitant, morador, was consistent undercounting of the subject African population of the colony. In response, in 1796, the Crown specifically indicated that the population of each Portuguese settlement should include blacks, as well as whites and mixed-race individuals. Nevertheless, there were many obstacles to counting the slave population of Mozambique, so that Wagner concludes, quote, "What is clear was the imprecision of information referring to the universe of slavery in East Africa," end quote. Yet for purposes of taxation and agricultural development, slaves were an essential component of the population. Whatever the Portuguese crown may have desired in enumerating its colonial inhabitants, however, it is clear that the driving factor in counting its slave population was abolition. In 1835, Sebastião Xavier Botelho recorded in his Memoria Estatística sobre os Domínios Portugueses na África Oriental that, quote, "The slaves existing in the city of Mozambique and on the farms of the mainland amount to more than 5,000 slaves of both sexes and all ages," end quote. In 1843, the Crown ordered a census of slaves in its East African colony. A year later, the Governor General amended the that the difficulty of this task was greater than his ability to render an accurate accounting. It was, he wrote, quote, almost impossible to verify the number of them, not only because many of them run away, but also because the inhabitants of Sena and Tete in Zambezia did not declare the accurate number of slaves that they possess. The resulting 1844 census counts a total of 22,122 for the territory, excluding Sena and Tete, while the total of 6,893 for Mozambique, which are hard for me to point to from here, suggests that Botelho's earlier estimate was not far off the mark. 5 years later, according to the reported 1849 census, the enslaved population of Mozambique City and its districts, it's the Conselhos, totaled 9,760. This figure suggests either a serious increase in the enslaved population or more diligent counting, as does the total for the entire province of 43,196, which is almost double the number from 1844. So you can see the difference from 1844. The total of 536 reported at the end of December 1844 for Cabo Delgado strikes me as a significant undercount, an impression that is sustained by the total of 5,233 slaves registered for the district in 1849. It's not there. According to Daniel Domingos da Silva, scattered data gathered from official correspondence yields a total of 41,365 slaves registered, not just existing, but registered between 1857 and 1862. These figures roughly agree with the total number of 40,000 some registered enslaved Africans reported by João Andrade Corvo, who had served as Portuguese Minister of Foreign Affairs and of the Navy and overseas in the 1870s. However great the inconsistencies of these early slave censuses, they clearly reflect, first, the intention of the Portuguese metropolitan government to assert greater control over its East African possessions, and second, the reluctance of slave owners to register their chattel. Now, Abolition and Libertos in the African colonies. Among European nations, Portugal came late to abolitionism. The Portuguese colonial economies were built on enslaved labor. Abolition merely disguised Portuguese reliance on forced labor. In James Duffy's words, quote, slavery became free labor, contract labor, forced labor, and the slave became a worker, but a traditional relationship was unchanged, end quote. When Portugal finally enacted abolition in 1878, the metropolitan government had already established a framework for the transition to a new system of forced labor. Most studies of abolition and the transition to contract and forced labor in Portuguese Africa focus primarily on Angola and São Tomé and Príncipe, while those for Mozambique concentrate almost exclusively on the export of labor to South Africa. What is missing in most accounts is a discussion of the brief history of liberated Africans. This legal transition began with a detailed regulation pertaining to libertos that's dated October 25, 1853, and the royal decree of December 14, 1854, that required the registration of slaves and, quote, declared free those who were not registered, while slaves who had acquired freedom were called libertos, end quote. Fresh slaves brought from the interior and purchased at the coast were considered to be libertos, but were still obliged to work 10 years for their masters. Those who were already enslaved and had become libertos as a result of the new law were still required to work 7 more years. Theoretically, they had the right to purchase their freedom, and a Junta Protectora dos Escravos e Libertos was to be established with responsibility to adjudicate such cases and to stand as guardian of the rights of slaves and libertos. A law dated April 29, 1858, quote, gave freedom to slaves 20 years after the publication of the law, which is to say April 29, 1878, end quote. Finally, as a consequence of mounting British pressure and the internal dynamics of Portuguese politics, on February 25, 1869, a royal decree abolished slavery, quote, moving all the slaves to the status of libertos, subject to the services to which they were contracted, but only until April 29, 1878. Muita confusão. This series of overlapping legislation and royal decrees may not always have been internally consistent, but the final result signaled the end of slavery in Portugal's African colonies. Thus, after 1869, all former slaves were designated libertos, but they still owed various periods of service of labor to their former masters, and all of these relationships were supposed to end by 1878. As it happens, and has thus far been overlooked by most historians, one specific category of libertos was already established, namely freed slaves who were state property. When Carlos José Caldeira visited Mozambique in 1852, he found that the local navy yard possessed, quote, some 180 slaves, which they called libertos da nação. In Brazil, the origins of such public slaves dated to the confiscation of Jesuit properties in 1759. When these Brazilian public slaves were liberated in 1871, they still owed 5 years of service to the imperial state. For the Portuguese Empire writ large, however, the roots of this practice appears to be the royal charter on the illegal slave trade issued at Rio de Janeiro on January 26, 1818, Article 5 of which declared, quote, "The slaves made over to my royal treasury shall be delivered into the office of the judge of the district, whose powers I enlarge with that jurisdiction to serve as freedmen, libertos, for 14 years, in any public service of the navy, the fortresses, agriculture, or manual trades, as may be thought most convenient." And that odd language is the 19th century British Foreign Office translation of the Portuguese treaties so that they're side by side. The December 14, 1854 royal decree mandated that liberated slaves were to receive a carta de alforria, or a letter of freedom from slavery. According to the Observações column in the Register of Libertas for Cabo Delgado, of the more than 3,000 registered libertos in Cabo Delgado, only about a dozen received this invaluable letter. If any other registered libertos from Cabo Delgado ever received a letter of freedom from slavery, no record has yet turned up in the archives. This situation may, however, be explained by the fact that, as we have seen, registering as a liberto was not the same as gaining one's emancipation. Two such instruments of freedom or full liberty that are reproduced in British records for Angola reveal that these documents were only issued after an individual liberto had fulfilled the required terms of apprenticeship. Thus, we find that both João de Ambaca and João de Calandu were, quote, emancipated from slavery in March 1848, but each only received the full instrument of his liberty 4 years later, in June and July 1852, respectively. So there's a difference. In the political and economic geography of Portuguese East Africa, Cabo Delgado, which comprised both a foothold on the coastal mainland and a series of settlements, churches, and fortifications on the offshore Karrimba Islands, was a backwater. So here are the islands and on the mainland. Yeah. The town of Ibo, which you can see, where is Ibo? Right there. You can see Ibo better than I can here. The town of Ibo, located on the island of the same name, was the administrative headquarters of Cabo Delgado, extending a distance of some 320 kilometers south from Cape Delgado, and that's up at the top, which today denotes the coastal boundary between Tanzania and Mozambique, and before that, between Omani Zanzibar and Portuguese East Africa. The entire region was an integral part of the Swahili world, with links north to the Kilwa coast and Zanzibar, and out to the Comoro Islands and northwest Madagascar. So you could see running up the coast, the East African coast, across the Mozambique Channel to the Comoro Islands, which are shown there, and across to Madagascar. Although a governor officially ruled the Cabo Delgado district, the region was very much left to its own devices. In the 18th century, slave trading in Mozambique grew steadily, following a growing demand for bonded labor created by the development of plantation crops on the northern Swahili coast, the Comoro Islands, and from the French-controlled Indian Ocean islands of Bourbon, La Réunion, and Île-de-France, Mauritius. So this is just a big map showing you how the currents run and showing you out here, Réunion and Mauritius. Rodrigue is actually part of them, but it's not really the major thing. Responding to the 1796 royal order noted above, in 1798, the Portuguese colonial government conducted a census for Cabo Delgado that includes an enslaved population of 2,940 men and 3,053 women, for a total of 5,993. This is a figure that exceeds the 1849 census of 5,233 by 760, and possibly suggests a decline in the collective fortunes of the slaveholding society of Cabo Delgado. Indeed, during the first 2 decades of the 19th century, the Karrimba Islands and Cabo Delgado region suffered from a series of maritime raids by Malagasy from Madagascar seeking captive labor. They basically started on the east side and would go around and raid the Comoros and then come over to Mozambique. And they eventually get up as far as Kilwa and the Mafia Islands in what's now Tanzania. But by the 3rd decade of the century, the ending of these raids and the official opening up of ports that had previously been subordinate to Mozambique Island facilitated a more normalized set of export trading relations and a major increase in the dimensions of the slave trade, mainly to and through Ibo, but also other small towns along that coast. As Portugal reluctantly yielded to British pressure to abolish the slave trade, the Karrimbas remained a source for both clandestine slaving and, during the 1850s, the libre engagé system, about which I'll say a bit more later, to the new French Indian Ocean plantation islands of Nushi Bay and Mayotte. And I think the best map for that is here, so you could, Nushi Bay is up here. Mayotte is the last of the Karrimba Islands down here, which is closest to Madagascar. And they became French colonies in the 1840s. And as well, slaves were also, and libre engagé also went to Réunion. Growing demand for agricultural labor on both Zanzibar and Madagascar further stimulated the trade. Another area of growing export was the ivory trade, while the collection of cowrie shells for markets in India and West Africa continued to be a significant economic activity. All of this increased economic activity was nurtured by the growing community of Indian traders at Karrimbas. According to the published figures recorded by former governor of the Cabo Delgado district, Geronimo Romero, in 1852, the total number of free inhabitants in the whole district was 1,088, and that of slaves, 5,277, about 80%. Essentially the same as recorded in the 1849 census. Within a few years, however, the officially reckoned population of both Ibo and the entire district appears to have exploded. In 1852, Ibo alone numbered 630 free, 1,792 slave, while in 1852, the figures for Ibo were about 1,402 free and 3,988 enslaved. And for the entire district, it was 6,075 free and 17,291 enslaved. So there's big expansion. Either you can't tell methodologically whether it was a demographic expansion or just better counting. It's very difficult. You can't know. At best, again, we possess conflicting figures from which to assess the transition from legal slaveholding to the post-Amantian labor regime in this part of Mozambique. Nevertheless, this baseline is especially important because, to the best of my knowledge, and as José Capella has also noted, no one has yet located the actual slave register for Cabo Delgado that was required by the 1854 royal decree that initiated the slow process towards emancipation in Portuguese Africa. And we have located slave registers for Mozambique, partly for Mozambique, for some of the smaller places, Lourenço Marques, but not for Ibo, so we're still looking. The Portuguese government published the December 1854 royal decree in the Diário do Governo on December 28, 1854. When it reached Mozambique a year later, it was published in the first 3 numbers of the Boletim do Governo da Província de Moçambique in January 1856. Seeking to emphasize the significance of emancipation and the protection of libertos, over the next 4 numbers of the Bulletin published in the, 4 numbers, the Bulletin published the October 53 Regulamento sobre os Libertas as well, that defined the rights of freedmen. A further order from the Ministry of the Navy and Overseas Provinces establishing how owners were required to pay a fee of 500 reis, that's old reis, for each liberto registered, was sent out from Lisbon on the 5th of March, 1855, and also published in the Bulletin in February 1856. Indeed, an important element in the registration of both slaves and libertos was to raise revenue for the developing colonial state. In July, the Governor-General published a Regulamentus Relativo ao Tratamento dos Negros Libertos. So there's all this stuff happening. How did this play out on the ground? On the 8th of March, 1856, the December 1854 orders were transmitted from the Ilha de Moçambique to the governor of Cabo Delgado, who then issued a bandu on the 10th of April that required all slave owners to present their slaves for registration and payment of fees at the government office on Ibo within 30 days. 3 months later, the governor lamented the resistance of many slave owners to this order, in particular in Kisanga, which is on the map there, a little north of Ibo, where most slaves had been withdrawn about 4 to 5 leagues into the interior to their farms, while at Pangani, most of the inhabitants had abandoned their huts along the coast and resettled about half a league inland, where the governor could not pursue them. So they just moved away. The governor further complained about the lawlessness and lack of respect for the government, so that, quote, I judge the registration of slaves entirely impossible, except in this town in Karrimba, in other words, on the island where there was a real Portuguese presence. In fact, in Cabo Delgado, the registration was delayed for several years. A year after Ibo reported its inability to enforce registration, the Governor-General sent a model that each slave owner was supposed to use when registering a slave or liberto. In Mozambique itself, registration was initially postponed by the opposition of slave owners. But by June 1857, it was apparently being enforced, and a detailed schedule and procedure for registration was established. Later that same year, the Governor-General ordered the new governor of Cabo Delgado, who was the same Geronimo Romero, to implement registration. Finally, in May of that year, Governor Romero, who clearly recognized the resistance to registration among slave owners and was an abolitionist himself, ordered the royal treasurer and interim director of the Custom House to carry out the registration, quote, with the greatest prudency and circumspection, so as to avoid trouble or incorrect interpretation among the inhabitants of this district. I like that because they were looking at it the right way. It wasn't the incorrect interpretation. It was the right way because they wanted to register their slaves. Anyway, a month later, because registration had not been completed by June 20th, Romero issued a stern bando that kept open the period of slave registration until July 14th, when it would be closed, quote, and everyone who did not comply with the law would lose rights to their slaves, end quote. Yet despite the threatening language of Romero's order and a further reminder sent from Mozambique to Ibo, nobody was registered. In February 1860, the interim governor of Cabo Delgado, José de Cunha Carvalho, who was tired of being blamed for negligence in completing the registration, applied additional pressure on the royal treasurer to complete his assignment, for which he had already been responsible for 21 months. A fortnight later, Carvalho finally reported to the Governor-General, quote, the constant impediment hindering the completion of this order and his appointment of a sergeant to try to achieve its enforcement. In March, the Governor-General replied with great frustration that, quote, until today, only the District of Ibo has failed to comply with that decree of December 1854. 2 months later, Carvalho had apparently succeeded, as he reported, sending 2 books of registered slaves and libertos resident in Cabo Delgado district, together with the registration fees collected from the slave owners for registering their slaves that was sent to him. Both registered were acknowledged as being received a month later, and the Governor General ordered that the maintenance of that for the Libertos was to be kept in the local archive of the Secretariat, quote, where the Libertos imported from the mainland must be registered. They're trying to build up a process here. Finally, prompted by the fact that the decree of the December 14th, 1854, quote, not having been rigorously observed in the district of your government, in July 1860, the Governor General issued a circular that was intended to enforce registration through a series of strict bureaucratic measures designed to limit the ability of former slave owners to avoid compliance, and inserting the state into the enforcement of registration more assertively than ever before. The circular also required that quarterly reports on Libertos be sent to Mozambique. Thus, the Metropolitan pushed to implement these new policies, and varying degrees of colonial resistance continued. And this brings us to the Cabo Delgado Register. The Register of Libertas for Cabo Delgado is a bound volume that is located in the Arquivo Histórico de Moçambique in the Fundo do Século XIX, Cabo Delgado, Códice 11, 1936. Following a standard form established by Lisbon, and you can see it's a printed form, and then you fill in whether it's a register for escravos or for libertos, and it has at the bottom both the 1853 and the 1854 laws referred to. Following a standard form established by Lisbon, the register entries cover 2 pages with the following headings, and since I can't really point to them easily, you follow them from left to right. Número de ordens dos senhores, nomes dos senhores e suas residências, número de ordem dos libertos, nomes dos libertos, sexo, masculino, feminino, naturalidade. Naturalidade is an interesting term because it can mean place of birth, but also can imply nationality, or what we might call ethnicity. Then idade provável, anos, sinais, marks, oficiais, and finally observações, anything you wanted to add. In Cabo Delgado, the process of registration extended over a period of 15 years, from August 30th, 1860 to October 19th, 1875, so just a couple of years after it should have started and a few years before full emancipation. Although registration began slowly in Cabo Delgado, it picked up pace in 1861, the year in which the largest number of libertos were registered, no doubt a consequence of stricter enforcement by district officialdom and the threat of losing the labor power of their slaves and libertos. Still, as late as November 1861, the governor of Cabo Delgado, by then João Lobo Teixeira de Barros, dispatched a series of letters to the governor of the Moors. So there were different Portuguese officials on the mainland and also officials for the indigenous people. So this is to the governor of the Moors of Kisanga, for the mainland settlement that was a notorious center of illicit slave trading and had already proved to be resistant to registration. Remember, they moved their slaves inland. And you can see how close these places are. Frustrated by the continual refusal of Kisanga residents and even the Portuguese subordinates there to accede to government orders, Barros threatened, quote, that all those who do not register lose their property rights to the same slaves as the law determines. At the beginning of December, he ordered an officer of the garrison to accompany the treasury clerk charged with registering slaves and libertos to Kisanga. The absence of further correspondence on this pocket of resistance suggests to me that this exercise of colonial authority, encompassing the repeated threat of losing the labor of one's workers, very likely succeeded. In following years, in addition to a regular if reduced stream of registrations, the Cabo Delgado government seems to have fulfilled its obligation to send quarterly statements of taxes collected on the registration of both slaves and libertos. Now, the register includes the names of about 400 or more masters, senhores, many of whom registered their libertos on numerous times, 6, 7, 8 times, right in a few here and a few there, and 3,007 freed slaves. Regrettably, there is no indication of how information was collected. Did government officials go from residence to register libertos, or did masters come to the government locations at Ibo to register their libertos? The models published in the bulletin for both Mozambique and the opposing mainland settlement of Sankul, which you can see, if you can see, the Ilha de Mozambique, Sankul is just to the south, suggest strongly that masters were expected to come to government headquarters at Ibo or at the mainland centers of Portuguese authority to register their libertos. Similarly, the model for Sankul indicates that the enslaved were expected also to present themselves at their registration as libertos. So, did individual libertos themselves testify as to their names, ages, and naturalidad? And did they do it in Portuguese, in Kimwani, the local Swahili dialect, or perhaps some other local language, such as Emakua? We have the recorded answers in the register in Portuguese, but how are the questions phrased? Information was recorded that way, but it only records one half of the process of data gathering. A different challenge concerns naming practices. Whereas the names of most masters include their family names or patronymics, those for libertos do not. It's just a single name. So tracing their descendants is almost impossible. In addition, most libertos had Portuguese or Arab Mani names, some of which are explicitly slave names, such as Saguat, which means gift in Portuguese, or Mubruk, which means blessed, Mubarak. It's not a name a free Muslim would have been given. It's a slave name, just like Saguat, Trezor. Similarly, the attribution of naturalidad appears often to have sometimes reflected geographical origin, as in the many libertos whose naturalidad is given as Murima, which is Kiswahili, just means a costa, the coast, meaning the coast, or more commonly Ibo, or some other specific locality within the Karrimba Islands in the Cape Delgado region. In other cases, the register clearly indicates what we can identify as ethnonyms, although such responses could also have been meant to indicate place of origin. In either case, how was the question of naturalidad phrased, for example, in Kimwani, where it could have been, where are you from, where were you born, what is your tribe nation, if it was asked in Kimwani rather than in Portuguese. Lacking documentation that describes the process of data collection, we will not be able to answer such questions. Unfortunately, there is very little meaningful information under the categories of body markings, which can sometimes help to identify ethnicity. And for example, in the Register of Libertas for Lourenço Marques, which only has about 300 or 400 names, it has, almost all of them have indication of body markings, so you can tell sometimes if somebody's a Makua or a Yao or from one of the southern Mozambican peoples, because it gives us an indication of the cicatrizations on their bodies. Nevertheless, there's still a wealth of information we can derive. A different question concerns the number of libertos, and maybe in the interest of time, I'll go through this, but the bottom line on the number of slaves is, and I have a chart, is that about 2/3 of the slaveholders only had one or up to 4 slaves. In other words, they were household servants. There was not a big, but there were a few people, as you can see as you move up the chart, there were fewer and fewer owners who had large numbers of slaves. And they clearly had plantations, probably both on one of the islands and on the mainland. It will come as no surprise that most of the overwhelming number of masters were men with Portuguese surnames. At the present, we're having some difficulty deciphering the entry of names in the register. And I'm saying we because I'm working with Daniel Domingues de Silva, a Brasileiro who was a historian of the Atlantic Ocean. We're trying to decipher the entries of names because it's hard to tell if some of the names are, for example, Francisca or Francisco. So we have to read the whole registry very carefully to get the gender breakdown. But it's clear that there are a large number of Portuguese named women who were also slaveholders, donas, and you can always tell when there's a D in front of the name. I should emphasize here that these names do not mean that all who bore these names were metropolitan Portuguese. Some were born clearly in Portugal, and some were probably first generation born in Mozambique. But I think it's safe to assume that many of the men and women were probably of mixed Afro-Portuguese descent. The number of non-Portuguese senhores totals almost 100, basically about a quarter of the total. Most of the non-Portuguese masters were Gujaratis, both Hindus and Muslims, and only a few appear to have been Swahili or Mwani, one of whom was a woman named Fatima, so we know, she was a woman. Finally, although without question most libertos were registered by owners whose place of residence is listed as Igbo, during the mid-1860s, the clerks stopped recording masters' residencies, so even the numbers are incomplete there. Nevertheless, in addition to Igbo, as masters' places of residence, the following locations are noted as having libertos registered. And you can go Pemba, look at the map, going south to north, Pemba, Arimba, Kisanga, and Olumbwa on the mainland, and then Karrimba Island, Mulonji, which is probably Mionji Island, Malize, which I think is probably Vamizi Island, and Vamizi itself is also named. So they're kind of strung out. Eventually, as comprehensive a determination of the named ethnic identities of the libertos remains to be undertaken. We're working on that right now. Although the category of naturalidad certainly does complicate this quest. First, among the names are Makua and Yao, the two most frequently enslaved groups of Africans during the heyday of the slave trade in East Central Africa. Other names of interior ethnicities include Maravi, Niassa, both of which would be called Chewa today in Malawi. Mangoshi is a Yao subgroup in Malawi and Niassa province. Lomwe, who very closely related to the Makua. Mwalia was the town of the most important Makua chief of Medo, which is the area in the inland behind Cabo Delgado. And a few Makonde from the plateau. So up, they're from up there. There are also a number of libertos listed whose naturalidad reflects local towns and villages, Ibo and Arimba, or in the islands, or Mukodro and Mosimbwa, both located on the mainland, while a number of libertos simply give, as I've indicated, Mrima, meaning the coast in general, as their naturalidad. Mozambique also appears in the register, suggesting that at least some former slaves have been brought to the Cabo Delgado region from Mozambique Island. Like those individuals who gave their origins as being of the coast, these names suggest that they may have been born into slavery, or perhaps were driven into that status through indebtedness or pawning. The general impression one gets from this mixture of names is that the Afro-Portuguese society of the Karrimba Islands and Cabo Delgado mainland was very ethnically diverse. In fact, a social extension of the Swahili coast to the north of Cabo Delgado, with the addition of a long history of Portuguese settlement. Not that different in some ways from Zambezia, but with a Swahili element as well, the Indian Ocean element. Most of the libertos were young, with very few listed as being older than 40 years of age. Many children under the age of 14 are listed, and I've used 14 because that's commonly used in the slave trade, especially in the Atlantic. It's arbitrary, though. Eventually, we will do a comprehensive analysis of the recorded probable age distribution, and approximately 55% of the registered libertos for the whole region were male and 45% female. The last category in the register of libertos is observações. Many of these randomly entered comments, they're not consistent, were added to the register after the initial registration of the liberto, even years later, which is interesting from a bureaucratic functioning. I can't quite explain it myself. And they do not lend themselves to quantitative analysis, but they do provide some insight into the broader history of Northern Mozambique during this period. For example, a number of deaths are recorded among libertos in 1871, during the fourth great cholera pandemic of the 19th century, which reached Ibo in February 1871. In a period of only 5 weeks, cholera took the lives of at least 453 Africans in the town of Ibo alone. Other notations record the flight of individual libertos from their masters. Among these were a male Makua named Lurado, who was stated to be 5 years of age at the time of his registration in 1860, and a few years earlier, so he may have been about 11 years old when he fled his master, a man named João Salvador Dias, in 1866. And also there was a female Makua named Susana, who was 32 years old when she was registered. So she must have been almost 40 when she ran away from the same master in 1867. He must have had not good person to work for. Further scrutiny of the registry, as well as the existing archives, may well reveal more substantive details about mortality and the phenomenon of runaways, marronage, for Cabo Delgado and the Karrimba Islands in the later decades of the 19th century. Yet another example of how this document might provide a basis for digging deeper into the social and economic history of this remote region of Mozambique is to use the list of masters to check against the appearance of individual names that are identified in the documentation for the district, such as general correspondence, judicial proceedings, tax records, and shipping licenses and passports. If there are any recorded wills in the official record, these can also be an important source for social history, as has recently been demonstrated for Salvador de Bahia. Church records may also be an important source of evidence. Still another kind of connection might be found to exist between the names of Liberto masters. For example, among the Muslim names of masters are Momadi Antumani, Monomadi Atumani, and Ibrahimu Mahamudi Antomani, all of whom resided at Ibo. Almost certainly, if they're not the same person, almost certainly these men were kin and were probably members of a successful Gujarati merchant family that had different houses. Although becoming liberto may have been designed to provide a first step towards individual freedom, in reality, however, as a clearly frustrated Corvo, the former minister, commented bitterly, quote, "Slaves came to be called libertos, but abuse made libertos slaves, even to being sold into the clandestine slave trade. Indeed, according to 3 of the only 18 documents in the Mozambique archives for the period covering 1857 to 1876 of the Junta Protectora dos Escravos e Libertos for Mozambique, Corvo's acceptance was indisputable. So to be libertos did not protect one from being sold. Further evidence that to be libertos did not guarantee freedom comes from some of the observations in the register. Thus, 2 male and 2 female Makua who were registered as libertos in November 1861 were all sold on February 4th, 1862, to Tito Augusto de Figueiredo. Similarly, 3 Yao male libertos were sold on the 11th of December 1864 to Joaquim Francisco Colasso. I've so far identified at least another dozen individuals who were sold after being registered as libertos, while several others were clearly used as collateral to pay their master's debts, as is indicated by their notation of their belonging to it. It will say, "E pertence a qualquer pessoa," to someone else. When British Consul J. Frederick Elton arrived at Mozambique Island in late 1875, he commented, quote, long quote, "All the property owners on the mainland hold libertos and slaves. Slave discipline is still carried on. Slave punishments are not discontinued, such as working with a heavy log attached to the leg by a chain." You've probably seen photographs of that sort, but there are none from here. Slaves are let out to work for hire, are lent to foreign commercial houses for consideration, and whether termed libertos or slaves fall under the English interpretation of the word slave. For in the case of the liberto, the equivalent of his labor is never received by him. He is not in the position of a man engaged for a term for certain work. He can be put to work for any person whom his master chooses to hire him, on the terms his master chooses to agree to, end quote. Whether these conditions obtained in Cabo Delgado cannot be determined from the existing evidence. But in view of the continuing open slave trade and the thinly disguised French commerce and contract laborers from northern Mozambique ports, Elton's caustic remarks seem likely to have prevailed there as well. There are clearly many intriguing leads for future research that emerge from this review of how Portugal thought to use abolition to extend its feeble control over its East African possessions. The Register of Libertas provides an opportunity to explore the possibility of following up on the life trajectories of both masters and libertos. For example, do any of the descendants of the masters listed in the register still live in Mozambique or in Ibu? If so, do they possess family papers? Lacking family names makes it extremely difficult to trace the libertos or their descendants. But perhaps there are families who have preserved the Carta de Alforria of an ancestor. This would be an important piece of paper to have. In addition, what possibilities exist in the official archives of Mozambique? Let me give two illustrations of two late 19th century examples, and then I'll be able to finish up here. First, in the 1880s, France was in desperate need to recruit laborers for its Indian Ocean island colonies. So, based on an 1881 agreement with Portugal to recruit libre engagé laborers from Mozambique for plantations on Nushi Bay and Mayotte, efforts were made to revive recruitment from Ibo, where it had previously flourished in the 1850s. And remember that France abolishes slavery, the slave trade in 1815, but slavery in 1848. But in the post-abolition atmosphere prevailing in 1882, neither of the two French commercial firms established at Ibu were willing to serve as the recruitment agency for these workers. The French then turned to a local Portuguese, whom British consul Henry O'Neill at Mozambique named as Senhor Gonzagas. According to O'Neill, quote, "This gentleman is a very old inhabitant of Ibu, often known by the sobriquet of the King of Ibu, must have been the Rei de Ibu, and was, before the Emancipation Act, one of the largest slave owners of the district. He has considerable influence over the native chiefs in the vicinity and will doubtless be able to procure laborers, if anyone will," end quote. Now we know from the Register of Libertas that Luis João Gonzaga was indeed one of the major slave owners in Cabo Delgado, having registered exactly 100 slaves as libertos. In the end, however, O'Neill wrote, and I put this up here so you can sing along with me, "It would seem that the natives absolutely refused to credit the statements that only willing emigrants were to be taken. The notion that an authorized slave trade upon a large scale was about to be undertaken appears to have taken possession of them. Acting under this impression and determined to resist what they believed to be an unwarrantable encroachment upon the liberty of late years granted to them, they assembled in large numbers, armed, and, I am told, attempted to disarm the sentries on guard," end quote. This action by Africans, almost certainly libertos, who had lived through the period of abolition and emancipation, precipitated a violent response from the Portuguese guard, who killed or wounded dozens of protesters. The number is not clear, 20, 30, 40, causing the flight of many others to the mainland. Unsurprisingly, over the decade from 1884 to 1894, only 33 workers ever signed contracts to work in the islands, and there is a register of those 33 in the archivo. That's my first example. The second example, when the Portuguese began to require identity cards for their African subjects, some 1,383 cards were issued at Ibu in the first half of April 1894. The official register includes each name, occupation, and employer, patrão, while those listed only by name, occupation, and place of residence were evidently independent: carpenters, tailors, fishers, stonemasons, whatever. The names of employers include at least 3 Portuguese who also appear as masters in the Register de Libertas. One João de Barros Carrilho, João Lopes Coelho, and Bernardino Barros Coelho. More intriguingly, among Bernardino's 20 employees who acquired identity cards in 1894, and it's a separate list of 20, are included at least 3 men whose names suggest they may have been registered as Libertos in 1861. Although it is more than a century from 1894 to the present, Italian anthropologist Francesca De Cleach recounts that in the present century, quote, oral histories collected in the last decade on Ibo Island still call servants slaves, while the social identities of many individuals were still cast in relations to their masters. Indeed, De Cleach notes, the descendants of slaves were ignored as a social category on Ibo Island. For example, in 2014, she was told about a female personal slave whose name was remembered as Zina Rakonani, meaning, what is your name? That's in Kimwani, and that's exactly the same as standard Swahili. If I meet you, if you're meeting, you say, Gina Lake Nani, what's your name? And I'd say Gina Langu Ned or Gina Langu Alpers. So it's not a name at all. In other words, this woman had no real name of her own, while her given name reveals the persistence of slave naming practices. Whatever the status of Liberto may have meant in the late 19th century in Ibo Island, its social significance appears to have been lost in the following decades. It is no surprise, therefore, that the former slaveholders of Ibo continue to subjugate their former slaves in Libertos. As Joaquim Ferreira observes for Angola, quote, instead of providing a path to freedom, the status of Liberto became another form of unfree labor, barely distinguishable from slavery. In January 1878, just months before the final abolition of slavery in the Portuguese African Empire, and with it the ending of the status of Liberto, the governor of Ibu wrote to the chief administrator of Olumbo, this is there a little north of Ibo on the map, on the mainland. Actually, it's just opposite on the south in the peninsula sticking out, very close. And he wrote decrying, quote, the free labor and hateful subjugation of the former Liberto. He continued to rail that the law ending the status of the Libertos was accepted with bad will by a great part of the inhabitants of the district, who had as a unique source of income the abominable traffic in slaves, end quote. So in view of recent research on the persistent memories of slavery in the Atlantic world, it seems important to determine how the memory of slave origins at Ibo and in Mozambique more generally, on the other side of Africa, evolved over time. But that project remains for the future. Muito obrigado.